the majority of history that we have is largely taken from Suraj Prakash. So when McAuliffe is writing his, history of the Sikhs in English, when he asks for source material, the Panth at that time suggests to him that you should read Suraj Prakash. And he does take from Suraj Prakash, but there's elements of it that he's like, oh, it's Indic mythology, Hindu mythology, I'm going to throw that aside. He doesn't know how to utilize that, and he doesn't know how to contextualize that in the context of storytelling.
What's going on, everyone? It's Ramblings of a Sikh here with another podcast episode. This time I'm joined by someone who's been heavily requested by our audience, academic, historian and Suraj podcast curator Jvala Singh. As you probably guessed, we'll be discussing everything related to Suraj Prakash and more, so don't forget to like, comment and subscribe. Otherwise than that, let's get straight into it.
Oh, thanks for having me on. Really appreciate it. It's been a long time coming, and glad we can make time for this.
Thank you so much. I think you can attest to the amount that I've been bugging you to come onto this podcast, and I appreciate with how busy you are and everything that you're doing, that you've taken the time out today to do this. Before we get into the thick of things, could you possibly just, in a couple of sentences, explain to those listening what Suraj Prakash is?
Sure, yeah. So for those who don't know anything about the Suraj Prakash, this is a text written it was completed in 1843. We'll go over how long it took to complete it, but this is a text which studies the history of all the 10 gurus, starting from Guru Nanak up to Guru Gobind Singh, and it provides basically the Sikh community with its own epic. Like this is like the epic for the Sikh community. This is the single most largest single text we have in the Sikh community. It's 60,000 verses long. And it takes the listener through a journey through every single emotion. The poet, Kavi Santokh Singh, the author, has constructed in such a way that the listener experiences, happiness, sadness, enthusiasm, fright, biras, heroic spirit through all of these stories. And it really is something that has lasted the test of time. This is written in 1843, but still to this day, a Katha discourse is done of this text every day at the Takhats in India, and we're seeing it in the diaspora as well, in Vancouver, Toronto. I've seen it in California, London, perhaps other places in England. People are engaging with this text, and that's why we've taken this on in the Suraj podcast to convey the text in its accurate meaning and its original in English. And we can talk about the podcast later on, but that's just a little kind of a brief summary of the text.
Just two things I wanted to follow up on. So you'd mentioned that it was completed in 1843. How long did that take to compile the whole text? And then secondly, you mentioned it become very well established in the gurdwaras kind of around India and around the world. Like, how does that happen?
Yeah, it's just a clarification there. I did want to say that. So it was completed in 1843, but it basically took about 10 years to construct. So the poet Santokh Singh, he writes the first portion of it, Nanak Prakash, in about 2 years, and that's about 10,000 verses. And that was, I think, from 1821 to 23, around that time. And then he writes the last component from Guru Angad Dev Ji up to Guru Gobind Singh, and that he writes from 1835 to 1843. So that's about 10 years in total. So it did take quite a significant portion of his life to write that. And even the publication of like the way we have received Suraj Prakash today through by Veer Singh, he himself also took about 9 years to publish that, almost close to 10 years to publish that, meaning he had manuscripts of the text. It was already being published in Ladivar, in the script that's kind of all conjoined. And what he was doing to make it easier for people to read, he was splitting up the words in something we call padshad or praya, and that took him 10 years. He was also adding footnotes that his father had made of the text as well, and he was also adding commentary and this massive introduction. It was like 250 pages, just the introduction for that text. So he also took about 10 years to publish this text. So it was a very lengthy process to get this text firstly constructed, and then Veer Singh, when he's publishing it in printing press, to put it out there for the wider audience so that they can read it. But we know that, so it was completed in 1843. We know that by 1880, this text was just everywhere. We have so many writings about this text. We have, like, for example, do you know Leitner's text, right? Indigenous Education. In that, he talks about, the poet Santokh Singh has made himself immortal. This is the words that he said. And he's writing out all the other significant, poets, authors of the community. He says Santokh Singh has made himself immortal through his works. And he's also talking about, various translations of Santokh Singh's works at that time. I think they were writing it in Shamukhi. Some princely states were doing that for greater access. And also you have like the legends as well, like Baba Sumer Singh, Takat Patna Sahib Jathedar, one of the best Braj poets. He talks about Santokh Singh's writings. This is in 1880 as being like the jahaj, like the vessel that is going to take Singh's across, because for them, like, this is how they enjoyed this text so much when reading the history. This is another thing I want to stress about this text, is that this text is not just on this date the Guru went here, on that date the Guru went there. Like, when you read this text, you're just so absorbed in kind of the flavor, the ras of these, wild, amazing stories of the history of the Guru. So you have other people like Gyani Gyan Singh who are basing large amounts of their work on Suraj Prakash, which he even writes. And Veer Singh himself, like all these people. So both sides of camps, like we'll get into this later when we go into the Singh Sabha period. But, this text was renowned through any, camp that you were in. You looked at this text and you were just in awe of it.
Considering it's not Gurbani, how is Kavi Santokh Singh's work able to so quickly become, say, on par with the works of Bhai Mani Singh or Bhai Nandalal?
Yeah, because it's a unique position, right? So, and this is something I want to get through to the audience as well, is that this text obtained such a unique position within the community. So you mentioned like Bhai Nandalal, Bhai Gurdas. These people have written, poetry, and it's sung in gurdwaras as well. But the story of the Santokh Singh's works is like, so when he has completed Gur Pratap Suraj Prakash, he takes a manuscript to Akal Takht. And various sources mention this. Veer Singh writes about this, and he offers it to the Akal Takht as an offering that I've completed this work. And it appears that even by that period of time, like Santokh Singh does not become famous after. It appears that even at that point, people from around Amritsar were streaming in to see Santokh Singh. At that point, he was, I think, around the age of 57. I'm not exactly sure, around that age. And he was quite sick at that point when he was completing Suraj Prakash. And so people were streaming in to kind of see him. And he did an ardas there to kind of offer this text to the Khalsa Panth at Akal Takht. And they took it in, and they were just, the people that were leading the community were so shocked at how amazing this text was that they kind of mandated it at that point, that we should read this in the afternoon. And if you go to like Takht Huzur Sahib, Takht Patna Sahib, etc., in the afternoon they have Gatha there. I think it's around 4:00 every day of this text. I think for about an hour. And this is important because many Gyanis think the first body, the first step into Sikhi is through itihas, is through history. Because if you don't have an understanding about what Guru Nanak did, what Guru Gobind Singh did, what the other Gurus did, then how are you going to be interested in what they wrote? So it's like the first step for building a connection with the community. Hence, it's done at a time when people would come to the Gurdwara in the afternoon, just after work or what have you. And, they would engage with history. And then through that engagement, then they would slowly trickle into Gurbani, because Gurbani is very, a difficult subject to just dive into, without knowing anything about the culture, without knowing about the gurus. So this provides that connection. That's why Sumer Singh, when he's writing, he says this is the jahaj, the ship, which is going to take the community across, because it provides that bridge, that gap, that through this, they can understand the gurus, they can understand the history, and then through that, they have a connection with Gurbani. And this is something that Santokh Singh himself writes in the text, is that those who read this, this, text has, just like at the end of Chandi Divar or at the end of Anand Sahib, a portion called Fal Shruti. Fal Shruti means the fruit of listening to this text. At the end of the Chandi Divar, it's like, Fer na juni aya jine gaya. That's a very common thing, right? People have at the end of text. Santokh Singh has his version of that, saying as well, like, those who listen to this katha will have more prem for when they read Gurbani. They'll have a better connection with the Guru, because you're so immersed with these stories, right? And, it provides historical context, Uttanaka, for a lot of Gurbani as well. When did the Guru recite this? Who was he talking to when reciting this Gurbani, etc.? So because it provides that gap, it provides this connection to attached to Gurbani. Many of the Gyanis at that time have mandated that this be done every day, and this is a tradition that continues to this day.
That is fascinating. You mentioned that Suraj Prakash is around 60,000 verses and is an epic in its proportions and ability to immerse the reader. So would it be fair to say it's kind of similar to Mahabharata or Ramayana?
This is our Ramayana. This is our Mahabharata. This is our epic. Yeah, and this is not my own opinion. This is how scholars have thought about this text as well. And this is how Santokh Singh himself was trained as well. Santokh Singh, before writing Guru Pratap, Suraj Prakash, and we'll get to this, his other writings. Santokh Singh writes a Braj version of the Valmiki Ramayana for his patron Raja Uday Singh of Kathal. And so he has training in this, and he has training in kind of curating stories from start to finish. And that's another thing that I want to stress. Like, why does Suraj attain such a status as it does? Is because he's not just coming up with these stories, off the top of his head. What Santokh Singh is a curator. He has all these sources, and he's curating that information in the best way possible, using the best storytelling techniques that he has available to him, and presenting that to an audience. So, for example, and we'll get to the controversy as well later on, but a lot of the controversy that people kind of point to Suraj, saying, oh, Santokh Singh is saying X or he's saying Y and Z, those sources can be seen prior to Santokh Singh. Like, he's taking information prior to him, that what is available to him. For example, in Janam Sakis, by Mani Singh's literature, in the Gurbalas, Pache Chemi, Dasmi, etc., Sikhandi Pagatmala, etc. And he's just, conveying that in a very accurate manner, mind you, which is something that has been a point of amazement to me as I do my research, is how closely he is, adhering to his sources that he has at hand. So yeah, that's one point I find really funny, is about the controversy that people lay on Santokh Singh, but really that is coming well before him.
We will certainly come to the controversy a little later on. For now, I would love to get to know a bit more about Kavi Santokh Singh. Who is he? What does he do? What happens to him? And another point which I was probably going to save towards the end when we discuss the Singh Sabha period and kind of everything that goes on there, although I now feel it's the kind of better place to just mention, which is that time period is often characterized as like a decline of Sikhi, but yet we've got the work of Kavi Santokh Singh Ji coming out in literally the heart of this. So how does that, what does Kavi Santokh Singh Ji's work say to us about that time period?
This is a good question, and we'll slowly unpack this. But so Santokh Singh is born in the late 18th century. So he's born in 1787. He's born in his lineage. His family is of a rather lower caste, Chimba, just like Namdev. And so by all means, at that point, he's coming from a really, unprivileged kind of background. He's born to, his father's name is Deva Singh. We know all this information just based on basically how he writes about it in his own text. So he's born to Deva Singh, and I'm not sure if he lists his mother's name there, but he praises both of them in his text for an upbringing. Deva Singh apparently taught him Gurbani. He was quite a smart kid at the age of 10, 11. Deva Singh then entrusts him in the heart of the Sikh community in Amritsar at the Akal Takht, at the Gyaniya Bunga. So this is really important when learning about Santokh Singh and kind of his creations, is that Santokh Singh is trained in the heart of the Sikh community. Santokh Singh is not somebody who is kind of on the outskirts, or somebody who is part of, let's say, for example, and this is speaking very loosely, like he's part of an Udasi order, or he's part of a Nirmala order, or he's part of a, let's say, even like a Nahang order. Like, he is at the heart of the community here. The Gyaniya Bunga, for those who don't know, is kind of this a tradition, this lineage of a teaching institution based at the Akal Takht, coming back to Bhai Mani Singh. His writings, like the Gurbalas Pache Chemi, Pache Dasmi, these writings come out of the Gyaniya Bunga, essentially. So he's trained by basically the most learned Sikh, Gyani Sant Singh. Gyani Sant Singh is, the head of the Gyaniya Bunga at that point. He writes his literature, by the way, blows away people at that time, and it's something that's really interesting, but it's kind of really lost on the Sikh community at this point. He writes, commentary on Tulsidas's Ramayana, and or sorry, Ramachartamanas, and it's so widely known and kind of praised that people are in shock across India, being like, some Gyani in Amritsar wrote like this exquisite text. And this information came out only when I was reading about Ramchartamanas in other classes, outside of the Sikh field. And that name came up, Sant Singh. And I was like, oh my God, that's the same Sant Singh from the Gyani Bunga. Anyway, so that's something that needs to be unpacked in further research as well. But Sant Singh was just, an exquisite scholar in Sanskrit and Braj. And that's where Santokh Singh kind of cuts his teeth. He's learning Sanskrit, he's learning Braj Pasha there. And he spends a significant amount of time there, I think 5 to 10 years with Sant Singh, learning before he goes off and begins traveling and collecting stories of the gurus. And that's something as well that Santokh Singh is really renowned for, is that he would kind of travel around. Leitner actually mentioned this in his text, saying that Santokh Singh is just known for traveling across, collecting stories, writing stories, etc. So he's trained in kind of this, in the heart of the Sikh community at that point. This is early 1800s, and then he kind of bounces around. Santokh Singh does, writing different compositions. He wrote his Nanak Prakash in the 1820s. Eventually, he lands in Patiala in the princely state. Karam Singh, Raja Karam Singh, provides him with some patronage. And then he moves over to the princely state of Kathal, which in 1843 gets taken over by the British. But until then, Santokh Singh would stay there, receiving generous patronage from Uday Singh, the Raja there. And that's where he would write the majority of his works.
I wanted to ask them, once the British arrive, what happens to Gauri Santokh Singh? What's his fate?
Yeah, it's this really interesting part, because Santokh Singh ends his Suraj Prakash talking about this. So Uday Singh doesn't have a son. He passes away. The state kind of goes into chaos. Gathal, that princely state. The British come in and they just loot everything. They steal everything. He talks about this actually in the last couple of lines. He says, thankfully, the Guru has given his hand and he's protected me, like not even a hair on my head has been bent. So Santokh Singh, by all means, apparently is saved from any type of physical harm at that point, but his body is not well. He's sick at that point. So when the British come in, they steal everything, they loot all that area. And then he moves up to Amritsar to, provide that text to the Akal Takht. And then the historical information so far is a little bit, gray. It's unclear. It's something I'm diving into in my dissertation of exactly what happens to Santokh Singh. But some eyewitness accounts mention that when he's strolling into Amritsar, he's not well. And he passes away shortly after he provides that text to the Akal Takht. So this is why actually the text is so interesting, is because this is written just at the cusp, right? Like this is the peak of the pre-colonial text. He's literally writing, the British are on the doorstep and now they're in the house, and then he closes off his text, which makes this text so interesting, because it's like it's a pre-colonial text, and it's just like, all right, now the British are here. And then 100 years after that, Veer Singh publishes it, in the height of the Singh Sabha era, when you would imagine that this text would receive a lot of criticism. Some criticism we'll talk about today, and Veer Singh does his best to kind of refute those, or contextualize that.
Did Gauri Santokh Singh have any children, and what happens to his lineage?
Yes, yeah, he had so he got married at a late age in those days. I think he got married at 35 when he came to Kathal. So in those days that was quite late. He ended up having something like 7-8 kids. His eldest had a manuscript. So when he passed away, there was about 4 or 5 manuscripts at that time. His eldest took one manuscript to Anandpur Sahib, and he began doing katha there every day, his eldest son. So he was training his kids and he was training people in the Gurdwara. And this is something we can talk about, his kind of routine there in Kathal, where he would wake up in the morning, he would do his Path Puja, and then in the morning he would write, he would study, and then in the afternoon he would sit down with his lakaris, his scribes. He had 4, and he would write the text. We'll go into that a little bit with more detail later on, but anyways, he would do katha in the evening, And so he would train people on Gatha as well. He would take questions, those back and forth and stuff as well. So yeah, he had descendants. The descendants had manuscripts. They would do Gatha of it. And his family still lives on today. He actually married outside of caste. This is what Veer Singh writes. Anyways, so he has a very interesting story. Like, he's from a low caste. He marries outside of caste when it comes to Gatal. He has a lot of kids. The kids continue on, with his Katha. His kids get threatened later on, Veer Singh writes about, because of certain components of that text, like the Devi Prasang, the stories about Chandi, etc. So yeah, it's Santokh Singh's story is just really fascinating.
As you've been talking, I kind of feel as though in some ways you could compare Kavi Santokh Singh Ji to Herodotus in that he's like one of the first big historians who looks at all of the source material before him. But at the same time, it also feels like he is perhaps kind of just an evolution in a tradition that has already existed. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, it depends what we mean by history, but I think just a very brief Sankheb way of thinking about this is like, from the 1600s, you have Bhai Gurdas. He is, the star that shines brightest in that era in terms of Sikh literature outside of the gurus. And then you have, in the 1700s, you have Bhai Mani Singh, and his works, Sikhani Bhagatamala, just a gem, expands on Bhai Gurdas's work. So Bhai Gurdas, in his 11th Var, his 11th ballad, he writes just the names of the Sikhs from, the first Guru Nanak Dev Ji, to Guru Hargobind. And there's no real explanation who those Sikhs were, what the kind of back and forth with the Gurus were, what the history is. So Sikhs asked Bhai Mani Singh in the 1700s, can you tell us about, these people? Bhai Mani Singh has inherited these stories from, staying with Mata Sundari, Mata Sahib Devan, Guru Gobind Singh, etc. So he then writes Sikhani Bhagatamala. He also has Guru Bilas Bachai Chemi written, Guru Bilas Bachai Dasmi written. It says in these texts, Bhai Mani Singh says to me, and then he's writing. So in the 1700s, you have Bhai Mani Singh, and then in the 1800s, you have Santokh Singh, which is taking Bhai Mani Singh's works and the Janam Sakhis and then writing on those. So I would say Santokh Singh is more of following in the tradition of seeing what's before him, and curating that in a way that relates to his audience at that time, which is what Mani Singh was doing, is what Bhai Gurdas was doing as well. And then people after him, like Veer Singh, are also doing the same thing. When they take what Santokh Singh has written and then write it in really like simple Punjabi for people to read at that point. So, all of these people are kind of following in that tradition. But there's different styles of literature through these, and that's something that Santokh Singh had to struggle with, or had to think about when curating, at least, because the Janam Sakhi literature is a little bit different than what you have in the Gurbalas literature. The Janam Sakhi literature is not as concerned with chronology. It's not as concerned with kind of dates. In Gurbalas literature marks a little bit of a change in that regard, where you have more structured dates and a kind of a A to Z in terms of a history. So, and he's trying to curate all of that into one prabandha, one kind of collective narrative.
So would it be fair then to say that the different styles of literature that appear at different points reflect the state of the Sikh community? So the Janam Sakhi literature is concerned perhaps more with the philosophical teachings of a great mystic, the Gurbalas literature coming much later on, when the whole community is more concerned with dates and times.
Yeah, and this is going to go also into one of your questions about what inspires Santokh Singh to do what he did, is that he writes at the beginning of his text that he, in his looking at Sikh history, especially the Janam Sakhis, he's thought that there is some malavat, there's some kind of exterior information that has been put into there that kind of doesn't make the Guru's praise shine as brightly as it should. So he is thinking that he's going to curate the history in a way that is without any of this nonsense. So he's also taking bits that he thinks are appropriate, and he's curating that as well. So yeah, in the same way like Mani Singh is doing, he's trying to take what's before him and kind of present it so that the audience at that time has a better understanding of the Guru's history.
In relation then to the Santokh Singh Ji's works and his curation of his work, how does he go about picking his sources and then also deciding what to include and what not to include?
So, my dissertation work is largely focusing on this kind of reverse engineering Santokh Singh's works, which is what Veer Singh tried to do as well. When he's looking at Suraj Prakash, Veer Singh is kind of looking at the previous texts, Guru Balash Pachai Chemi, Daswin, Janam Sakhis, and kind of trying to figure out, okay, what components align with what. And you can see, like, for example, I'm looking at in the Swedish podcast the stories of Guru Hargobind, and those relate to the stories written at the behest of Bhai Mani Singh and Guru Bilas Pachai Chemi. And you can see the exact same structure, or very similar, in very similar tropes, idioms, metaphors used in Guru Bilas. Santokh Singh himself is using as well in Suraj Prakash. The same type of stories, the same type of emotion. For example, like when Guru Hargobind has to, in battle, kill Pandey Khan, who is somebody that the Guru himself raised. The Guru starts to tear up. This is not Santokh Singh's, masala adding to this. This is written also in Guru Balash Pachai Chemi as well. So, this is something that I'm doing in my work, is kind of figuring out what texts were available to him, what he was using. But it is clear that he was using those Guru Bilas texts, the Guru Bilas Pachai Dasmi, Pachai Chemi. He's using Mema Prakash, he's using the Janam Sakhis, he's using Sikhani Pagatmala. You can tell when you have these side by side what he's using. But, as mentioned before, he studied under Sant Singh. Sant Singh in the Gyanya Bunga would have had all of these texts of Mani Singh available to him, and more than likely Mehma Prakash as well, that have come from Guru Amar Das Ji's lineage. So, in short, this is something that I'm going to kind of slowly expand on through my research. But Veer Singh does write that he has all of those texts, as mentioned, available to him.
Where are any of the original manuscripts, if they still exist?
Also something I'm trying to dive into. Veer Singh himself writes that he was not able to find at that point the original. Veer Singh talks about how Santokh Singh wrote this. So just to clear something up here, Veer Singh comes a significant time after Santokh Singh passes away, right? So Veer Singh is hearing these stories from his elders. So his Nanaji, so his maternal grandfather, was an expert on Suraj Prakash and had written many notes, Gyani Hazara Singh. He's also studied under the same school that Santokh Singh studied, Gyanya Bunga. And so Hazara Singh has notes. Veer Singh mentions this, like his grandfather made notes of it. So he's putting it in his published publication of Suraj Prakash. Veer Singh goes around, he talks to people from Kathal and other people in the community about how Santokh Singh compiled it, how he wrote it. Santokh Singh is sitting in Kathal. He's sitting in his Haveli, which is just recently purchased actually by Ganesher Singh. And he has 4 lakaris, he has 4 scribes. And he sits there, as mentioned before, he kind of studies the text likely in the morning. And then he sits with his lakaris, his scribes. He has some type of little pot or like a drum with him. And he sits there and he is playing this beat on it. And as he plays this beat, Santokh Singh does, which is according to the chand, the type of meter that he's writing in. So, for example, like a dohra or chopai or savaiya, he's then reciting the poetry just like that to his lakaris. And every now and then it says he has a little cup of dig that he's drinking as he's writing it, as Veer Singh writes. So, which he would call Navratana. So he's sitting there, and he also mentions that there's a bit of a parda, like a kind of a sheet in front of him and the lakaris, perhaps just to make himself feel more comfortable. I'm not exactly sure the meaning behind that. But Santokh Singh's sitting there, he's playing this beat, and according to the beat, he's reciting the poetry, and the lakaris then would write what he's saying. And then he would go in that afternoon or evening to the local gurdwara, and he would perform that gatha. And then sometimes he'll get questions from the sangat. If earlier you said this, how does this make sense? And then you can see this in Suraj Prakash. There's a bit of dialogue in there. For example, in the stories of Guru Gobind Singh, those stories come from Bhai Ram Kaur, who stayed with the Guru and Huzur Sahib for some time. He's from Baba Buddha Ji's lineage. And at some point, he leaves Huzur Sahib to go up north back to his village, Baba Buddha Ji's ancestral village. And then there's some stories after that. And then the Sangat asked Santokh Singh, hey, like you mentioned like Ram Kaur like went up north, how does he have these stories? And in it, he says there's a response there that Ram Kaur then goes down to Delhi. He stays with the Matama, like the mothers, Mata Sundari, Mata Sahib Deva. There was Balu Hasana there, I believe. I could be wrong in his name. Udasi Sadhu. Udasi Sadhu was staying with Guru Gobind Singh for some time in Huzur Sahib. He was up in Delhi as well. He stayed with the Matama. Ram Kaur had this discussion with him. And it says, Ram Kaur's like, I spoke with him 4 times. I clearly remember these stories, and then so I'm conveying that to you now. So it's really funny how you see that kind of back and forth, and perhaps there was some editing there as well in terms of Santokh Singh is perhaps like we're trying to relate now in how we understand material construction. Like perhaps like stand up a comedian is going to test his material out on a crowd and then say, okay, that line worked. I'll change this line here and there. Perhaps that's what's happening, but yeah, Santokh Singh as a kathakar, as somebody who's doing katha, was renowned in that area as well.
So you mentioned that Santokh Singh Ji is playing a drum and reciting his poetry. I'm assuming that he's done his research, reading and preparation beforehand and is then repeating what he wants written to his scribes, or is he engaging with the material and then telling his scribes what to write on the fly?
So Veer Singh writes about this and saying that it would be very difficult for somebody like Santokh Singh to just kind of make it on the fly, as you say, because he's in some portions he's very he's following his source material very carefully. For example, there's a portion in Sosaki that's like 100 ardases or something like that. And so Veer Singh gives that example, like how would Santokh Singh have memorized all of those and listing them in the correct order and all this type of stuff. And it's possible, like, so Veer Singh's suggestion is that in the morning, he would probably sit down and he would probably have his source material out there and he would probably write it there. And then he would kind of memorize his portion. So each chapter of Suraj Prakash, which is what we do on the podcast, is just one chapter, is one episode, is about 40 to 60 verses. And it's largely in a chopai meter, like how we recite Kabir Baj Benti Chopai. It's like that meter. Because it's a very narrative style of meter. And you see that in the Charitras a lot as well, Dasam Guru Granth Sahib. And so he probably either memorize that portion and then he would sit down with his lakaris and he would write his scribes and he would kind of recite that, or there was a parda there was a cloth there between him and his lakaris, so perhaps he had some books there in front of him and he was looking at it and he was like, okay, this line is like that, and then he would recite that line. But all of that is just based on what Veer Singh himself has heard from people who were there around that time. Even that part about the Sukha, he's like, people say that, but I can't prove it for sure. I mean, he's gonna say that because he doesn't want to just say like, he wants to give people an out to be like, people say it, but we don't know for sure. But he also takes other people's suggestions on other matters as for sure. So I mean, yeah, you can see his a little bit of a bias there.
What language is Suraj Prakash written in, and is it similar to Sri Dasam Granth in that it utilizes more than one language?
Yeah, so Guru Gobind Singh is just a master poet. He's writing across like so many different languages. Santokh Singh is a master poet, but he's writing primarily in Braj Bhasha. He writes in Braj Bhasha, which is like a language largely used in Dasam as well. You can think about it as an old version of Hindi. It's not utilized today. It's utilized in the works of Guru Tegh Bahadur. It's utilized in Adi Guru Granth Sahib, to some extent. But Braj Bhasha is the primary language in Suraj Prakash, and then Santokh Singh is a master of Sanskrit as well. So there's a lot of Sanskrit terminology and vocab in there, which is why Veer Singh has to put significant amount of footnotes to say, okay, this word means this, to explain to readers what these words are. But so I would say Braj Bhasha and Sanskrit are the main. So Veer Singh writes that Santokh Singh is knowledgeable of Farsi and Arabic to some extent, but like he says, like Sadar, and like he knows like an average amount of that. And his vocab, Santokh Singh, when, for example, Mughals are talking to each other, he'll like use like Farsi and Arabic vocab in there as well, which is really funny and interesting. But yeah, it's primarily Braj Bhasha.
So you'd mentioned that when Kavi Santokh Singh Ji takes his work to Akal Takht, it's very quickly accepted across the land by the Sangat, but also endorsed by Gyanis and teachers. Could you expand a little on its history and how it's received from that point onwards?
Yeah, so in 1880, like about 40 years after Santokh Singh writes this text is widely accepted throughout the community as like kind of the gold standard that this is what people should be engaging with. About 40 years after that, when Veer Singh begins this plan to publish the text, which takes him close to 10 years, even at that point, he says in his introduction that people at that point, and he mentions this because of the Singh Sabha Lehar, because of this movement of the Singh Sabha, that people were telling him, hey, maybe we should remove certain parts of Suraj Prakash. And this is something I wanted to clarify as well. You very generously were praising the podcast on Net Nahang's episode. And you mentioned I had said something like Veer Singh edited the text. Veer Singh did not edit the text insofar as anybody knows currently. That has yet to be seen. What Veer Singh does is, so in his introduction, he says, okay, people are telling me there's portions in Suraj Prakash that we should take out. And he says, he gives this whole argument of we shouldn't take anything out. This is against, the process of publication. Nobody in the realm of publication or history writing would deem that acceptable, which is interesting because we do know he edits Pan Prakash. Like he takes certain words out and he cuts portions out. So we'll leave that aside for now. So Veer Singh puts that argument saying we can't do that. But what we can do is we can put commentary, we can put footnotes, we can contextualize, we can explain why the poet Santokh Singh may have written what he did. I have theories on this as well that, by that time, Suraj Prakash is so widely established. If he were to come out with his own version, and there were published like printed versions of Suraj Prakash, they were ladivar though at that, and they're stone print or lithograph print. So that was already out there. If Veer Singh came out and he started editing portions like that and cutting portions out, perhaps it wouldn't have sold as it did. Veer Singh did have a publication house, so he was making money off of these things. So he would have to make sure that, so he had that angle as well. So he says, okay, we shouldn't edit it. It's against the process. So he puts footnotes in it, and he kind of spreads out the words so that, people who are less trained can engage with the text and still enjoy it. So and that's about the 1920s when he's writing this. It takes him about 10 years. This is the longest thing he's ever worked on. Veer Singh did a Kosh, a dictionary for Guru Granth Sahib, that took him about 7 years. He spent more than 10 years, about 10 years on Suraj Prakash publication, which just shows you how, and he's like enamored by Kavi Santokh Singh. If you read closely his introduction and throughout the text, he's in awe of the construction of Santokh Singh, of how he's building this text out. Even though there's portions of the text, like portions that relate to the Devi, Chandi, etc., which he, thinks is a product of its time. So he says that, that can't be. And so from that Veer Singh publication, which he came out in 14 volumes, that's basically how people have engaged with this text, Suraj Prakash, until now. I mean, very recently, in the past 10, 20 years, there's been a commentary written in Punjabi by Dr. Olak. That commentary I use in my work, but it is loose at times in terms of translation, so I take it with a grain of salt. I use it to help me in some respects, but I also have to listen to Gatha. So another way people engage with this text is through learning institutions like Nahangs, Taksals, Udasis, Nirmale and stuff, who have been teaching this text for centuries, for over a century essentially. And that's where you will hear katha of it. If you go online, there's people that have recorded the entire Suraj Prakash in terms of katha, which would take years to do, and it would take years to listen to as well. So what we're doing now for the first time ever is providing this text in English, which this has never been done, and which is interesting because the majority of history that we have is largely taken from Suraj Prakash. So when McAuliffe is writing his, history lyrics in English, when he asks for source material, the Panth at that time suggests to him that you should read Suraj Prakash. And he does take from Suraj Prakash, but there's elements of it that he's like, oh, it's Indic mythology, Hindu mythology, I'm going to throw that aside. He doesn't know how to utilize that, and he doesn't know how to contextualize that in the context of storytelling. So, he uses from it, discards it. And from those type of English works, we have what we have today in terms of a really kind of watered down, really black and white, really dull and dry type of history. Like there's no flavor in it, there's no essence in it. Um, and which is why I find really interesting the kind of feedback from the podcast is people are always like, oh, you have a way of like contextualize or humanizing the guru. Which I found out first really interesting because there are significant portions of karamat, like miracle components in it as well, right? Which is not unusual. We find that in Guru Granth Sahib, we find that in Dasam Guru Granth Sahib, we find that in Bhai Gurdas Vara, we find it in Bhai Mani Singh's works. So it's not like Santokh Singh making it up. He's following in a tradition. We have to just understand what that means, right? So you have to think about storytelling, etc. But there's miracle components, but yet it's humanizing because they talk about emotion. They show events through emotion and in a way to convey emotion, right? And that's something that we should all really think deeply upon is um, how storytelling relates to emotion, how katha has to relate to emotion to be effective, right? And that's why I think Santokh Singh's writings have lasted the test of time because they just immerse you with like, portions of it are tragic, like Bandit Khan passing away. Guru Hargobind's basically, adopted orphan. Like Bandit Khan was an orphan who the Guru adopts, he builds up, he gets him married, he gives him money, he trains him up martially, all this type of stuff. And then he has to fight him, unfortunately, right? And then he has to kill him. And then you get through that. And then you go through other stories. Guru Gobind Singh who's so like Bir Rasi and so kind of inspiring. Bichitra Singh's kind of battle against the Hathi, the elephant. These like pump everybody up. And it's interesting because another thing that Veer Singh notes is like Santokh Singh is not just a poet. Like Santokh Singh, he knows what he's talking about when it comes to military and martial, ability, which is really fascinating. Like he's not like some Udasi Nirmal Assad sitting there in the corner. Like even if you look at the painting of Santokh Singh, like he's holding a katar in his right hand, like a punch dagger. He's not holding a kalam, like a pen. Like this guy is a Jangi Singh, right? Which I found like really interesting and like how detailed the description sometimes in the battles of the duels of the gurus. I'm like, oh, like he actually knows how this would work, like where the arm would go if you're, for example, blocking a shield in this way and moving about that way. And it's just like the devil's in the details. Like it's just really makes a massive difference, and it hits the audience different as well if you're including those details and if you're engaging with emotion in that way.
I feel like Kavi Santokh Singh's work is one, if not the last, in the lineage of pre-colonial literature that humanizes the Sikh gurus and reflects the work of Arvind Mandir in Religion and Spectre of the Sikhs, in that there is a change in the construction of logic where we view mysticism and now kind of see that in the trappings of religion. Feel free to add your comments to that.
Well, about that, the first thing that comes to mind to me is just related to ideas about identity. And that's a big problem for some when they engage with Suraj Prakash, is that like I would suggest to everybody who's listening, if they can, wrestle and kind of, really cut your teeth on Mandir's works. Mandir's works are fantastic. They're very complicated and they're worth like, wrestling with for many months and years perhaps. But so Santokh Singh is writing before that specter of religion enters that mindset in Punjab, right? So he's writing in a way that's different to how we understand religion and identity now, and that's something that I have received comments on, like, why are the weddings performed in a certain manner, like Babak Rababi gets buried, he's a Rababi at the Pant, like why would he not be cremated? All these type of issues I think can be cleared up in knowing how people, thought about identity differently, but also about relating to divinity, right? Like how people are thinking about divinity. I think a lot of that, this is really good work out now by Julie Vidge, professor at York University, who's writing on Gurbalas, of how Sikh historiography, how Sikh history was written in a way which utilized Vaishnava concepts of thought. And that's one way to think about how the Gurbalas literature is using even notions about Devi and Chandi. They're using it in a manner not to substantiate those ideas, en masse, like all of what they say, but they're utilizing that to convey certain ideas about royalty, about kingship, and about divinity as well. So I would urge everybody to look. She has a book coming up, so just wait for that, and we can. I would suggest for you to have her on as well. I think she would be a great guest.
As you were talking, I quickly made note of her email, so thank you. I would certainly get in touch with her. There was one thing you mentioned, though, that I wanted to ask you, that was in terms of kind of translations and commentaries that have been published since. How do you think they deviate from the original or reflect the understandings of the writers and kind of their respective schools of thought?
So in relation to commentaries and kind of how Gatha is done and perhaps dissertation, like distortions from the Gatha and from the stories itself, it's interesting because for those who want to engage with Suraj Prakash through like commentary, Tika, they have Oluk's version of it. And Oluk at times, for example, he'll either make a note underneath a line saying, classic missionary, like Hoini Sakta, like this is not possible. Or like he'll do something even subtle, where it's like, I've seen instances of this where it's like, let's say it's about Sukheli Dig or something like cannabis, and it'll say like, oh, Guru Samne, the Guru just drank water. Like he'll like convert Sukha into water. And he's like, he had a glass of water, and that water made him really happy. And it doesn't make it must have been really good water. So you have stuff like that, or you have portions I've seen online, people who do katha, perhaps on the wedding, prasangs, the stories about the weddings, where it'll say like the line will say something akin to, the guru or whoever is getting married walked around the fire, and then it'll say like, they did lama and then they read Anand Sahib and stuff. Like they'll just start they'll add to it and say these lines, right? And I guess they reflect notions about identity, which they think that, if the gurus performed these, rites, let's say weddings around a fire and what have you, that those would be deemed, quote unquote Hindu, which, I guess that's a long discussion as well. Like, what is Hindu? But I think I've been lucky, and there's people online that do this. Like I've been lucky to learn under Santakani Indrajit Singh, and he holds to the text, very strongly, and like he doesn't deviate from the meaning of the text. He always kind of stresses like, listen, if we don't understand the text, that's not the text's fault. That's our fault. Like we should do everything we can to contextualize. Okay, why was it written that way? Like, how can we understand it rather than always being like, oh, this doesn't, see fit according to me. Impossible. This is not right, which is a very humble approach to have. And I really want to stress that approach to people who are going to listen to the podcast or are going to engage with anything pre-colonial. It's like, listen, this was written in a different time. Let's try to understand why it was written in that way. And it's fair to have those questions. Like those questions actually are brought up in Sikhandi Bhagatamala as well. At the end of Sikhandi Bhagatamala, Singh's asked by Mani Singh, hey, the gurus had their weddings as you described around fire, the Brahmins there, etc. And just as a side note here, in these texts, when it mentions this, like Suraj Prakash, it always says, this is Kul Dirit. This is the tradition of the family. This is familial traditions. So it's like disassociating from a religious kind of tradition as well. It's saying, oh, the families, they've done this for some time. They're just doing that. Like, it's not really important in the sense of like, okay, now all of a sudden we are, quote unquote Hindu, which, those also definitions are very difficult to pin down pre-colonial. So Singh's asked by Mani Singh about this question, and it's actually really interesting. At the end of Sikhani Bhagatamala, this question comes up, and Bhai Mani Singh himself gets Guru Gobind Singh's daskat, his handwritten signature on this hukum, basically, to say that, listen, we in the past, the gurus have done, we've called Brahmins and what have you, but now we should read Anand Sahib for weddings. And then it says, after that, call the Brahmins and do whatever. Like if it's essentially, I read that as, if it's your familial tradition, go ahead, do it. It doesn't but read Anand Sahib now. Like this is now going forward, this is going to be a tradition. So those type of traditions evolved over time, surely. And nobody is going to read these type of texts and say, oh, we should go back to like doing all, like these traditions evolve over time. And the Kastaband has mandate to, I guess change traditions essentially as well, like to mandate, okay, we're going to do this now. The Guru has given authority in some sense, right, to the Kastaband to make these type of decisions. But yeah, so I mean, largely the distortions in terms of the meanings come from those elements where at the core of it, it deals with identity. Like, for example, even at the Devi Prasang and the stories about Chandi, a lot of the times for people who are engaging with Suraj Prakash in a Gurdwara, they'll have somebody doing katha of it. I've seen this in Surrey. When these type of stories come up, the kathavachiks just like kind of flip the pages and like hope nobody notices. And they're like, oh, yeah. So that that happens. The flipping the pages happens a lot, and which has given ammunition to the missionary side, where they say like, listen, the Pixalis and the rest of the lot who don't even actually believe in the text. Like they're actually giving ammunition to those people, which I think is the wrong move. I think the move should be you contextualize it, you explain it as best as you can, and if you can't, well then there's a learning opportunity for you.
Are there any similarities in the debate around Siddhi Dasamgranth, which raged, say, 10 or 20 years ago, and then slowly started to whittle down as the community became more informed, with now how we're seeing kind of controversies around Suraj Prakash slowly kind of whittle out?
Yeah. It's a good question. It's a really good question, and you're absolutely right. Like the kind of stance, the kind of the perception of Dasam Granth over time has changed. Certainly in the West over the past 10, 20 years, we can see that. I mean, it's not clear to me if that's because there's been a good contextualization of the Dasam Granth itself, or if the culture in the West has just changed. Like, for example, a lot of the objections to Dasam Granth have been to perhaps content relating to romance and like for example in the Charitropakhyan, right, you have sexual encounters and what have you. So I think in the West, the diaspora community has kind of just matured to an understanding that why couldn't the Guru write about these things? First of all, that's not the main thrust of the text. Like it's just so funny to me that the older generation, it's understandable, coming from a more colonialized culture of sexuality and romance and relationships, where that, if they were looking at a text which had any component of that, they would say, oh, this, how could the Guru write such, material? And I think just the diasporic youth in the West have understood that, okay, first of all, that's not the main thrust of the text. The text is talking about deception. There's not a manual on any of those type of, and in that storytelling manner, if these things come up, that's fine. Like, everybody grows up, they watch Game of Thrones or 300 or whatever people are watching in the West right now, right? So it's not unusual to encounter that type of material. So all of which to say, I'm not sure if the pro Dasam Granth camp has done a good job in contextualizing it, or it's just the reason why people were objecting to Dasam Granth. Those notions in the West have kind of fallen apart, especially like, let's talk about Chandi, for example, as well. Like, is it, it was really funny, and the objections to Chandi is like, oh, the divine can't be a woman. But like at no point people were like saying that about the Guru Granth Sahib, where it's like the divine at points are Purkh, Akal Purkh. It's like, oh, the divine can be a guy. That's fine. It's also a really blunt way of understanding the art, right? It's not a very intellectual way of understanding the art. But to them, yeah, the divine could be a dude, but it couldn't be a woman. Both of those are not correct, right? It's not to say that, the divine is like Chandi is a woman. Like, you have lines of Gurbani like the Paramatma is behind, beyond Purkh, Istri, and the Punsak meaning that third, right? That which has no Joda, that which is, it would be incorrect to say non-binary because that's going to bring in the dialogue of today's.
But
But
arguably,
that
non-dual is not. It's a non-dual existence.
yes, yeah. So Chandi as well in the West, I think people have been okay with conceptualizing the divine in certain circumstances as this feminine warrior, and I think that. So I'm not sure if it's just the fact that the pro Dasam camp has done a successful job at contextualizing it. So I think in the same way, I think in the West, understandings about storytelling are gonna be more acceptable to the youth than they were in, for example, a lot of the objection will be like, oh, the guru couldn't have done this. I think the West and the youth are taking a more open-minded approach to a lot of these things, because, and that's going to help, in engaging with these texts as well. So yeah.
So there were a few questions regarding what Suraj Prakash has to say about particular events. There's one about Vaisakhi, which I'll leave to later on, but the two that were requested the most were to ask you about Bhai Bidhi Chand and then secondly about Guru Tegh Bahadur Ji's wedding.
So yeah, I mean, I guess we could plug the podcast here at this point. So I start the podcast with Bidhi Chand's stories, which comes about halfway through Guru Har Gobind's life, in the sense of his stories relating to stealing these horses, Dilbag and Gulbag, these horses that are located in the Lahore fort. And yeah, Bidhi Chand is essentially like the Sikh Robin Hood, steal from the rich, give to the poor. Fascinating story. He goes to Guru Arjan Dev Ji. Guru Arjan Dev Ji knows he's a bit of a thief. Guru Arjan Dev Ji says, perhaps you should stop stealing. How about we start with that? And then Bidhi Chand's like, I'm not going to lie to you. I'm not going to stop stealing, but I am your Sikh. And then Guru Arjan Dev Ji says, okay, fine, but, steal essentially from the rich and give to the poor, help those in need, right? Which what Bidhi Chand does, there's stories in the text where he's, there was a poor Sikh who comes, he needs money to marry his daughter. I think this is how the story goes. It's covered on the podcast, and Bidhi Chand goes, steals from this abusive elite essentially, and then provides that poor Sikh with some money. So you have a bunch of these stories, and even contemporary sources at that time, Dabistan, written by a Zoroastrian who's going around, he mentions Bidhi Chand. He goes and then talks to his guru. The author has like a Zoroastrian guru, and he asks about Bidhi Chand as well. And the guru is like, these stories are exaggerated and stuff like that. But Bidhi Chand, he says, is known in the community as like this folk hero. Like he was the dude, So if they're talking about him, and Santokh Singh is taking stories not, off the top of his head, as I mentioned, these stories are mentioned in Global Pacha Chami, which is a text written on account of Bhai Mani Singh. Bhai Mani Singh is, describing these stories in Katha, and the author of that text is writing them down, saying, Bhai Mani Singh described this story to me, I'm writing this down. And then we asked Mani Singh about this question, then Mani Singh replied. So it's like back and forth, there's dialogue in those texts with Mani Singh. And yeah, Santokh Singh is not making these stories up. I think perhaps you can kind of talk about, are those components controversial, or how did that question come up?
So those questions were asked in order to try and glean some of the historical information out of Suraj Prakash and able to give a flavor to what you cover in your podcast. Someone had asked why Bhai Bidhi Chand is often characterized as being small, or if that is just kind of something that's come out of modern Sakya.
I've not come across any description about that. Guru Gobind Singh is mentioned in Suraj Prakash as having a smaller build. Guru Har Gobind as being like insanely massive, like for the North American audience, kind of like Shaquille O'Neal. But it describes, I posted about this, it's close to 7 foot tall. I think the measurements would be about like 6'7" to like 6'9" or something like that. Just enormous. And this was represented in contemporary art of the guru, with also how he's depicted later on. Even in the later 1700s, you have artwork showing Guru Har Gobind just like a giant amongst the other gurus in the paintings. But by Bidhi Chand specifically in Suraj Prakash, I've never come across anything. Perhaps there's more to discover. But at this point, we are about 60 episodes left, to the point where we cover all of Guru Har Gobind's Katha and his stories. So perhaps we can do another discussion on that if it comes up, but I don't think so. He's described quite as a very strong, very proficient warrior. He is the right hand, the muscle of Guru Har Gobind. He is Guru Har Gobind's essentially closest associate. When Guru Har Gobind passes away, for many months, many years, Guru Har Gobind is sad, it says. Both in Suraj Prakash and Guru Bilas Pasha Chemi, it says Guru Har Gobind has this sense of loss. Bidhi Chand, that essentially like it remains with him. Like he's just really sad after Bidhi Chand passes away. So which is really fascinating as well.
What does Suraj Prakash say about Sri Guru Tegh Bahadurji's wedding?
Yeah, so for those who want to kind of hear it in full, check out episode 35, 36 of Suraj podcast. It's literally essentially a line by line of those chapters. So each episode is me translating the text as it is. I'm not adding anything to that. I at times say, okay, as a side note, if I want to convey information about the location or about the people in the stories, I might add some contextual information in there, but I'm translating the text as it is. And, those episodes 35, 36, they go through Guru Tegh Bahadur's wedding, if everybody wants to listen, but they're done according to the weddings at the time. And I think it would be really interesting for people to listen in, because one thing that was interesting to me is that I was shocked at how similar the weddings are in terms of, like, they do Maya, they do Boliyan, they do all these type of things, like Milni is there, like all of these ceremonies that we have today in a Punjabi wedding, they're actually fascinatingly like mentioned in these texts. And I'm like, oh, that's like, so like fireworks are mentioned, which they had at that time. If you can, Google Mughal fireworks, and you'll find images of fireworks back in the day. Yeah. So yeah, I mean, there's so many of the small rituals there that are mentioned and kind of explained. So I really urge everybody to check out the wedding episodes. Some things that are different. The weddings, as mentioned in the text, happen in the late evening, basically nighttime, whereas today the modern Ananda College is going to happen, before noon. And yeah, like, wedding traditions in our Sikh community have evolved over time. That's clear. As described in the text, they're following their familial traditions, which in which they call Brahmins, and they're going to walk around a fire, the fere, the lama, etc. So that those portions are a little shocking to people, but the other portions are not so much, when they're like handing out, like in Guru Tegh Bahadur's wedding, like jalebis to people and like laddus, and like these are mentioned in the text, like big jalebis, big laddus, and etc. So um those type of points, I'm like, man, that's so interesting, because like now, after listening to the podcast, when I go to a wedding, I'm like, oh cool, like this is like 200, 300, 400 years old, these traditions, and they're still happening. And I don't know, I think it's valuable as well. Like anybody sitting there, even like one person who like holds a jalebi and it's like, oh yeah, they were handing out jalebis at Guru Tegh Bahadur's wedding. They've thought about the guru there, right? So
Yeah.
um but yeah, those portions can be seen as controversial, but I think it's best to just understand it as, yeah, that's what was happening during that time. Those type of rights, in terms of, birth rights, wedding rights, funeral rights, etc. As the community is developing, and surely it's developing, right? Like Khalsa Panth is not established during that time. Um, so, and the Masand system is still there. So we understand this, that there were elements that were there before, and then they got revised, and things were added to it, and things were taken away. And this is a process, right? And the Khalsa Panth continues with this process, because it has Gaddi as well, it's a guru as well. So there's nothing in there that people should be shocked of. This is like, that was a tradition at that time, and that changed over time.
So, what does the text say about the relationship between the Gurus and the Mughal power at the time? Because a lot of modern history reinforces the idea that it's just oil and water. Babur is the menace that starts this reign. There's a friendly period into Guru Arjan Dev Ji, Shahidi seemingly coming out of nowhere. So, what does Gavi Santokh Singh Ji say about the relationship between these two houses?
It's a very good question. It's a very good thing to think about as well, because I mean, this is a reason why as well I was so fascinated with the time of Guru Hargobind. It's like you have this shift, right, in the community, that this is the biggest shift the community has seen, right? And it's a shift in which a lot of the community is confused about, and you have these discussions in the text by Gurdas writes about this as well. Like a lot of the community was confused, like, okay, we are like a saintly people, and the guru's adorning weapons, and the guru's going hunting, and the guru's, essentially now fighting battles against the Mughals. How does this make sense? This guru sits on the seat, the gaddi of Guru Nanak Dev Ji, so those were real questions by real Sikhs, genuine questions, because they understood Sikhi in a maybe perhaps more superficial uh lens, in terms of just exterior practice, not in terms of essence, perhaps. But so that's why this makes an interesting time period to examine. But it's interesting because the Guru period, like the 10 Gurus, falls right over top of the seven essentially major Mughal emperors, Babur, Humayun, etc., all the way up to Aurangzeb and then Bahadur Shah. And I think for those who have not read Sikh history in any depth, they're going to understand, like you mentioned, water, oil and water, right? Completely separate. And there's a couple of facts that are well known. Guru Gobind Singh fought with Bahadur Shah in battle. Guru Har Gobind's time with with Jahangir in Lahore. How do we understand this? Guru Har Rai's friendship with Dara Shikoh, the prince, the elder brother of Aurangzeb. How do we understand these relationships, right? And the text goes into this. Another fact is like the land of Amritsar was given as a gift by the Mughal emperors to the Sikh community. Or at least that's how the text describe that kind of transfer of land. So if we were to take the text seriously, we have to acknowledge that. But yeah, it's a really interesting relationship that is a bit of a roller coaster. There's a lot of up and downs. Just like Bhai Gurdas mentions previously, before Guru Hargobind, the emperors used to come and seek blessings from the gurus. Babur came to Guru Nanak Dev Ji, Humayun came to Guru Angad Dev Ji, etc. Akbar comes to Guru Amar Das Ji, and
I think it's in Panth Prakash where it's mentioned that because the Mughals stopped respecting the house of Nanak, that's why their empire fell.
sorry, this is a major point in Suraj as well. It's that, essentially Guru Nanak Dev Ji blesses Babur with Raj, with kingdom. This is how the text understands this. And I just want to hold this thought and sustain it for a little bit, and we'll contextualize it. So the way the text talks about it is that Guru Nanak Dev Ji blesses Babur with Badshah, with kingdom, with this Raj, with this empire. And this lasts until the Mughal Empire then starts to disintegrate and fall into kind of oppression, so oppressing people of the state. And this is something that is coming up in the katha, in the stories of Suraj podcast, is that Guru Har Gobind now has just fought in the Suraj podcast his first battle with Shah Jahan, and Shah Jahan really is this point in which it really takes a downturn with the Sikh community. In Guru Har Gobind's lines, anyways, in Suraj Prakash mentions that Shah Jahan's being very oppressive to people, that he's fallen away from the Guru's house, that he's not paying tribute, that he's not, meeting with the Guru's house in good terms. And that's where this disintegration then starts to happen. We see that Guru Har Rai has a very special relationship with Dara Shikoh. And we know from contemporary sources that, Guru Har Rai, who maintains a standing army, rides out to fight with Dara Shikoh, but Dara Shikoh then kind of cowers and he's not able to fight. So, basically Guru Har Rai calls his troops back and there is no battle. But it was very close to having a battle there where they would have fought against Aurangzeb. And then we all know what happens was Aurangzeb probably remembers that feud between the Sikh community, and that the Sikh community supported the other rival. And this is the thing as well, if you read works about Mughal history, Munis Faruqi, a professor here at UC Berkeley, is writing his book on Aurangzeb, but his book on Mughal princes is really important to understand how these rivalries and how succession change in the Mughal Empire relates to conflict with different communities. And if we see that when Jahangir is appointed as emperor, then he starts stuffing out rivals as well. That's when Guru Arjan Dev Ji gets Shahidi, right? Because the people close to him, at least according to Sikh history, are telling him that, okay, this is one group over here, the Sikh group, this is like not a group that we should allow to kind of propagate. So in Sikh history, he later repents that, and he kind of meets with the Guru and he offers him money, and this, blessings given back for all that, there's a kind of a coming together at some point. Yeah, so understanding how succession change works in the Mughal Empire, how the princes were sent off to engage with different community groups, and then if that prince was victorious, then he's going to punish the other community groups that he's rivaled with. So yeah, it's a fascinating story, and it's one which is not black and white. And we know that even by reading stories like the stories in Panth Prakash written by Ratan Singh Pangu, where For example, when I think his name was Subeg Singh came from the Mughal Darbar to offer Kilit this, royal tribute to the Khalsa Panth, and he ended up giving it to Nawab Kapoor Singh, calling Nawab, right? Some of the Panth was not okay with that. Yeah, some of the Panth was like, we should never accept anything from them. And the other Panth was like, whoa, let's accept it and let's use it for our benefit. So it's understandable even today, like when we think about should we accept donations from everybody? Is it okay to accept donations?
I guess a good comparison is OBEs and MBEs. Another similar controversy surrounds Jassa Singh Ramgarhia, who is employed by imperial forces. Jassa Singh Ahluwalia doesn't want anything to do with that, and because of their friction, at one point Jassa Singh Ramgarhia shoots Ahluwalia through the arm, showing that these debates aren't that new at all.
These are long-standing debates. These are long-standing debates that have their roots in even the time of the Guru's period as well. So we've had these debates. You can see these debates played out in Rehetnamas as well. These like literature based on code of conducts and written in the 1700s, across the 1700s. And even in that, like it says, never trust a Toruk, never basically take money from Toruks, even to the point where you are deemed somebody who crosses the line of Rehet. And that title is Tankaya, somebody who has Tanaka, somebody who has a salary from the Toruks, essentially. That was their way of like kind of degrading that type of service, right? But yet we know, like Justice Singh Ramgarhia, that people did engage in that service. And it did benefit the Panth in some degree, right? In some degree, having people on the inside helped, right?
Talking about Jassa Singh Ramgarhia, once he gets employed, he gets everyone else, kind of his families and friends employed. But more importantly, he's able to help lift a siege. And it's due to this, actually, that he's welcomed back within the Panth.
This is where the nuance comes in, right? Where it becomes a much more difficult question than just black and white. Like, for example, in the stories that we've covered on the Suraj podcast, you have Vizier Khan, like a serious senior general of Shah Jahan and Jahangir, who's always pulling strings in the court. Like he by all means comes from a Muslim background, and yet he's a Sikh of Guru Arjan Dev Ji, Guru Har Gobind. And in the court, whenever he's hearing about decisions that perhaps might be detrimental to the Sikh community or the gurus, he's always there trying to pull strings and kind of orchestrate it in a way to like lessen the damage, or just completely change the mind of the emperor to not do anything. So you have these cases, right? So it's not fair to say like the situation is black and white, and the gurus did fight with the Mughals. Like Guru Gobind Singh fought to help a Mughal prince obtain kingdom. And that's like, you can't get around that historical fact, because this contemporary writings are greats, like Bhai Singh and others have written about it. So all we can do is try to understand how that worked. And that period of time is so fascinating, because like in a time when nobody was allowed to wear weapons in front of the emperor, you have, even in the Mughal archives themselves, Gobind Singh came adorning arms into the court, and you're like, god damn, that's really, really fascinating. When Guru Gobind Singh passes away, the Mughal court records talk about like, oh, should we confiscate all their money and land and stuff like that? They have a lot. And Bahadur Shah writes, we have no concerns with the fakir. It's like, we're not going to disturb the money and the land and the possessions of the fakir. It's like, so the Bahadur Shah on one hand understood Guru Gobind Singh as a fakir, as like a very pious holy man. On the other hand, Guru Gobind Singh is coming strapped up, like armed to the teeth into the court, and he's fighting in a battle. Like, so these notions are just so interesting when you think about it. Like, how do we view the guru? How is the guru viewed from outside? And that's another thing as well. People get a little bit uncomfortable when thinking about these relations, because in their mind, they think that, okay, this relates then to some type of subordination that the guru is working under. And I think we should revisit that, because Guru Nanak had a job, right? What was his job, right? Does that mean that his boss was like ahead of him? Or is this the Leela? This is the Kale, this is the game of the gurus, right? They're working on so many levels and different dimensions that for us to just look at it like, oh, in the economic hierarchy, like the gurus below, X person, this is, not, praiseworthy, and etc. I think that's the wrong way of looking at it. And I don't think that's how Sikh history has looked at those type of relations until more recently. So
Thank you for that. So the last question I wanted to ask in relation to Suraj Prakash was about what it says about Vasaki. So I know it's just around the corner from the point that we're recording, obviously. But the earliest accounts that I've come across from Sikh history written by Gaur Singh and Gorshish. Now, Gaur Singh states that goats are slaughtered by Guru Sahib once the individuals heed Guru Sahib's call on that day. Gorshish's story is slightly different in that it's the individuals who heed Guru Sahib's call who do the chatka, not Guru Sahib. And then he also specifically mentions the Panjbaniya that are recited on that day. What does Kavi Santokh Singh Ji say? What does Suraj Prakash say about this event, and how does he absorb the sources that come before him?
I think it utilizes those texts. Those I can't talk into exact specifics, but the general story is there is that the guru's calling people up. Most of the crowd think the guru has gone insane, and there's context to that as well in relating to the stories about Nana Devi and relating to Devi becoming Padgat and kind of the guru, meaning that the Chandi, the goddess, had become manifest in front of the guru. And bless the guru with a sword, a kripana khanda, etc. So the story is very much like the pre-colonial sources that you mentioned, Gaur Singh, Cautious. There's Sukha Singh's Guru Lajpat Dasmi as well, which Santokh Singh is using both of those, it appears. And I would also add Bansabi Nama also has a similar type of rendition to that. So Pant Prakash by Ratan Singh Pangu also has a very similar account to that. So all of these texts fall in line with a similar type of version of events. Like you mentioned, Cautious mentions various Barneys that are perhaps not mentioned by Santokh Singh's. Ratan Singh Pangu also deviates a little bit from that list as well. So there's going to be small differences here and there in regard to the story, but that story about the tent and the goats, I think, is pretty widely established in the pre-colonial literature, and that's going to seem very shocking to people who have not engaged with pre-colonial literature. But one thing I would add to that is that it really falls in line when you think about the stories of Guru Gobind Singh in regard to the master of the Charitas. Like this is somebody who wrote his largest composition was on deception, Charitarupakyan. And then what do you have there? You have a story about the Guru, enacting some deception. He's calling things up. He's calling Sikhs up. He goes into a tent. He comes out. There's a bloody sword. It falls very much in line with kind of the personality that we imagine of the Guru. And even other stories like that the Guru writes himself in the Charitas about, him going to a certain Tirat, a certain pilgrimage spot, and like he's basically asked like the Sikhs to go collect sropas from people, and they start like knocking people's pugs off and taking them. And I mean, it matches with the personality of the Guru. But yeah, I mean that point is shocking to people, I think, for whom they imagine the Guru. I think the story goes for most people that he decapitated them himself in front of everybody, and then he put the heads back on, etc.
And the extra masala is the heads were added to the wrong bodies, and they still.
Yeah, which I would add, like those types of mythological stories, you're not gonna find them in Suraj Prakash and Pant Prakash and these type of things for other events. So it's not. So like for those who are like, oh, Suraj Prakash doesn't believe the Guru can do all these miracles and stuff, I'd be like, read further. You're gonna find some fantastical stories in there as well, but not for that particular event. And yeah, I for those people that really enjoy that story, which I understand, right? Like, and this is our conception of the divine as well. That the divine gives life, the divine takes life, and divine can kind of restore life, and that every Sikh would agree on that point, that the divine has these capabilities, that Sarvagla Samrat, that the Guru has all powers and all that. So, those who are giving or shedding light on these stories, mind you, every single pre-colonial, like all of these pre-colonial, right? It doesn't mean that we think the Guru is like incapable, or that, we're trying to slander the Guru or anything like that. I think, if anything, I think the way that these stories are written kind of reinforces and kind of in a really entertaining way kind of describe the characteristics and the personality of the Guru, which I think is a really fun way of looking at it.
Does this have any relation to Chatka then, or is that kind of something completely different?
That's a good question. That's a question that relates back to the Chandi, and kind of sacrificing a goat, etc. But the beheading, like it's interesting. Suraj Prakash, there's a portion after when when Guru Gobind Singh leaves Mashiwar jungle, and it says he does jatka, but the way he does jatka is with a rifle, with a gun, and he shoots a goat in the head, which alerts everybody around that village, and it's a really funny story. The way it's written in Suraj Prakash, because he does this jatka with a rifle, he shoots a goat in the head, and then he takes that corpse and he like throws it at like there's like a Muslim who's reading, I think Kalma, is like doing the bong. He's like kind of on top of a mosque or something, and he's kind of reciting something, and he throws it at that guy. There's some story like that. Now I may be like off on some specifics, but so chatka not necessarily needs to be done with a sword, as mentioned in these texts, but there is an element which Nahangs talk about, especially the older Nahangs, as well. First of all, they think about the sword as Chandi, right? This is like embedded within the writings of Guru Gobind Singh as well, is that, the divine, the goddess, the Shakti of the divine as well is related to Shastra, not only the sword, but also a gun as well. Like, so for example, people always have this assumption that guns came after the Guru's period. And it's something that we should talk about more because it's really fascinating, that Guru Gobind Singh wrote more praise of the gun than he did the sword. If you read Shastra Namala, this text of the rosary of weapon names, Guru Gobind Singh writes in Dasam Guru Granth Sahib, there's more components there about rifles, which they had at that point, matchlock, flintlock rifles, than swords. Um, and so yeah, so rifles were used at that time. Contemporary sources even talk about Guru Hargobind having, I think, a 60 riflemen with him at all times, like riflemen with him. So, and we know, like, even Guru Hargobind had a pistol in one of the battles. It describes like the pistol was brought from a far off land, Vilayat, it mentions. So probably Afghanistan, maybe even Europe. So, yeah, so chatka not need be only with a sword, but yeah, it relates to notions about sacrificing for the divine, for Chandi. And the Hunks could go deeper into the mythology and the imagery of that, as well. The goat representing Kam, Krodh, Adik, like these kind of animal temptations and vices and instincts. And by chopping off the head, we are removing our even the Amrit ceremony as well is that, right? We offer our head. They always say to you, like at the dal, they say, "Sis Guruka," is your head the Guru's? And then they give you Amrit only after that, right? So that's the imagery as well, is that we are now removing our head and removing our incense, and we're giving our mat to the Guru. Like we take on the Guru's mat, not our own, not manmat, but gurmat. We take on the Guru's teachings. So I mean, we could go on and on about the philosophy about chatka, and it's funny now we're seeing that in the West happen as well, which is really cool. That the diaspora communities are reading back at these old texts and bringing a lot forward. I've seen chatka be performed in Surrey. I've seen it being performed in UK, and for sure it's been happening out here in Seattle and California as well. So
I think we'll certainly do a podcast on in future about Jhatka. There were just two questions then that I wanted to ask you about. These were the most commonly requested questions to ask you from our audience. The first is about the manifestation of Chandima Naina Devi, as you already mentioned, and the other is about what Kavi Santokh Singh says about Ragmala.
Yeah, we'll start with the Chandi thing. Is that number one is, like, for example, Veer Singh had an okay. So just to set the scene, before Amrit Sanchar ceremony, 1699, a year before that, these texts, Santokh Singh, along with others like Gaur Singh, Sukha Singh, these are written in the 1700s. Sikhandi Pagatamala also talks about Chandi becoming Padagat, Chandi becoming manifest. This is a writing of Paimani Singh. So Santokh Singh is following in that tradition. Santokh Singh is not inventing the wheel here and talking about Chandi becoming Padagat, becoming manifest to Guru Gobind Singh. Over time, this gets refined, this gets reinterpreted in different ways. For example, Gyan Singh, Gyani Gyan Singh, very famous Nodamala, in the late 19th century, talks about how what really became manifest through this fire, through this heaven, was a sword. And then Guru picked up the sword, and then he kind of used that sword in the Amar Sanchar ceremony, which is, he's taking a meaning from these stories and then he's interpreting it in a way that his audience perhaps would better deal with that story, because by that time of the early 1900s, notions about mythology and specifically Chandi were, not well accepted. I will mention that. So then the task becomes, how do we understand these stories from the 1700s, which deal with Chandi and Guru Gobind Singh, especially these stories about Chandi, not that Guru Gobind Singh writes the divine in a martial feminine light, because that can be easily understood. Just like how in Ad Guru Granth Sahib you have the divine often, written about through Vaishnava terminology, Ram, Raja Ram, like that's obviously talking about Ramchandra, but it's not talking about Ramchandra as only Ramchandra. So there's a use of Vaishnavite terminology, and then there's a shift and repurposing for our own purposes, for Sikh purposes. In the same way, Chandi is being utilized, just like Raja Ram and Gopal, Kavalan, all these words that would be used for Krishna, etc. as well. Chandi, and there's a repurposed version of that in Guru Gobind Singh's Bani as well. So that's fine. But now how do we interpret the stories where authors are remarking of Guru Gobind Singh, performing a havan, performing a fire ceremony, and then Chandi becomes manifest? I would say, and this is something that's interesting when studying. So what I do at what am I doing my dissertation in is historiography, studying when that means like how history is written, not just history, not just dates, but like why are historians writing in the way they are writing. And what comes out is this story about Chandi Devi becoming Padagat manifest. We are not the only ones who hold that story. In other Kshatriya and other warrior class groups of that time, their leaders were also doing havans and making Chandi become Padagat as well, which is really interesting, right? Because then it relates to ideas relating to kingship, it relates to royalty, it relates to the notion that one has the power to, fight in battle, to take on empires, to construct communities, etc. There's many reasons why perhaps these stories are being utilized in this way, but for sure the people at that time had this notion that Guru Gobind Singh was in some sense manifesting Chandi, and what that means can differ according to the level of nuance that you want to go into. Does it mean that the Guru was manifesting Shakti, some type of energy, and that he was inspiring that and he was transferring that inspiration into his Singhs, right? Why did he name us Singhs? Like Bansavi Nama in these texts mention that he named the community Singh because Singh is the Bahan, is the vehicle on which Chandi rides. What is Chandi? The sword. And that we are holding that sword, right? So there's many different ways and imagery which are being utilized here in which we can interpret beyond just, oh, did Guru Gobind Singh physically make some being that we all would view as, Hindu manifest? So I would just say that we have to think about these a little bit deeper, especially in regard to storytelling techniques and devices and what the Guru is drawing out from that. So one thing is clear is that, all these pre-colonial texts are mentioning these type of stories. Veer Singh, when he publishes Pant Prakash, he takes portions of the Devi out of Pant Prakash, which is, I find, really intriguing, fascinating, because when he's putting in his introduction that we should not edit text of Suraj Prakash, I find that, yeah. But that point, right, about Devi is something that I think needs to be contextualized correctly. And I think with that contextualization, it becomes less problematic when we take a look at these stories. So Ragmala, yeah, it's interesting. So Santokh Singh, he's, as I mentioned before, Santokh Singh is somebody who's very cognizant of source material. In his writing of Suraj Prakash, he is looking at, okay, what did Bhai Singh, what did other people write before me? And then he's very consistent with that material. I think in a similar way, um, it's that approach that he takes when he's looking at Ragmala. So he does say, just for the record, that yeah, Ragmala is not the writings of the Guru, and that's going to be interesting to a lot of people because they think that that controversy occurred in the early 1900s with the Pasorie, with the lot associated with Akhand Kirtani Jatha. The debate goes back a little bit prior to that. And we know that because other people like Nirmala has also mentioned this, that some Nirmalas are against Ragmala as well. Yeah, so it's not fair to say that that debate occurred only in the early 1900s. That had some type of debate prior to that. Now, Gurublas Pachai Chemi, no, I've not looked at the manuscripts entirely, but Gurublas Pachai Chemi does mention that Ragmala is Gurbani, and in the Pai Mani Singh Sarup of Ad and Dasam, there is Ragmala there as well. But Santokh Singh's argument is based on source material because he's looking at a poet named Alam, and he sees that a very, very similar text is identical, that Alam is writing, and it's dated to prior to the construction of Ad Guru Granth Sahib, or Ad Granth, in 1604. So he's looking at that and he's seeing that, okay, Alam Kavi has written this prior to Guru Arjan Dev Ji's construction of Ad. So therefore, that's one reason it can't be Gurbani. The second reason is that he's looking at Gurbani and he says that, I think this is the argument that he writes, I could be corrected, but he writes that in every line of Gurbani there's talk about Nam, and there's talking about Amrit Ras and these type of elements, Bhakti, and in this composition of Ragmala there is none. And so he uses these two elements to conclude that Ragmala is not Gurbani. So that is an interesting component because it shows that there was some type of controversy prior to the Akhand Kirtani Jatha kind of leading the charge on that front. But yeah, certainly I think that's his argument on that.
Thank you. Just a quick one to everyone listening. If you want to find out more about the different Ragamali of the time and kind of dive further into this, Kamalpreet Singh Pardesi, also known as Sikhism in Snippets, has written a small but very interesting book on this topic that you can buy from his lulu.com website. Just moving then into the questions regarding your podcast, the Suraj podcast, there were two main questions. The first one was, do you have any plans to continue your podcast after the stories of Guru Hargobind Sahib Ji?
No plans as of yet. So we look to finish Guru Hargobind in the midsummer, which would be, we're recording this now in April 2022. So mid 2022, probably finishing up Guru Hargobind. I personally am completing my dissertation. I will be at that point, and that is going to be a busy period. But we are looking to continue at some point, certainly as the legacy project, the stories of Guru Gobind Singh. But yeah, I mean, I would throw this back at the community to say that these type of projects require funding, they require support, and with support we can make this happen. But yeah, it has been a struggle to kind of keep the podcast going while teaching and while doing my PhD. So we'll have to see how things work out, but as of yet, no plans to continue.
And then the next and probably most requested question was, will your translation work of the Suraj Prakash you've done so far, or any that you do in the future, be available in any other format, most specifically a book?
That I do have some good news, and I guess we can release that news here, is that there will be something coming out in regards to that. So basically a modern day Guru Blas of Guru Hargobind's life. We hope to have some illustrations. These illustrations are being already commissioned, detailed illustrations depicting Guru Hargobind in battle, depicting Guru Hargobind's life, weddings, associates, all of this. So that is something in the works as well. So that will come out absolutely if everything goes as planned. And I do want to say that Guru Hargobind's stories in Suraj Prakash, if we cover all of them, which we will by mid 2022, that is a fifth of Suraj Prakash. That's it's over 20% of Suraj Prakash itself. Because Guru Hargobind, besides Guru Nanak Dev Ji, which you can count essentially his Guru period as when he was born until he passes away, Guru Hargobind is the longest reigning Guru
besides Guru Nanak Dev Ji. So he has a lot of stories. Now in Suraj Prakash, so he's the longest reigning guru besides Guru Nanak Dev Ji. But in Suraj Prakash, the most extensive component of Suraj Prakash is Guru Gobind Singh's Katha. There's Guru Gobind Singh stories in there. But Guru Hargobind is a second to that. So by doing this, we have covered like a fifth of the stories in Suraj Prakash. It would have taken us about 2 years to do that. And that actually makes about sense in regard to 20% in 2 years, because Santokh Singh himself took about 10 years to write the entire thing. Veer Singh also about 10 years to publish it. So I think we're trying to do on par with that. So yeah, so hopefully in the future we'll have more components coming out, but as of yet, no plans in regard to the other gurus. I would love to have time to do Guru Har Rai's Katha. His stories are so interesting in the sense of, his relation with Dada Shakol, his interest in medical sciences, and, taking care of animals and all this. Very fascinating. So hopefully, but yeah, I can't make any promises in regard to more stories just now at this point.
Thank you for that, and thank you for sharing that information on here. Considering how large and how deep Suraj Prakash is, why do you think it's not perhaps received the attention as other texts such as Prem Samarag or Gursobha, some of these perhaps being more widely discussed?
English is the reason. Prem Samad and Guru Soba have been translated in English. Diaspora communities, even simple Punjabi becomes difficult, especially when it's embedded with, technical terminology. So you can very easily have a simple Punjabi sentence. You throw some terminology in there that's a little bit difficult, perhaps relating to the Sikh tradition, and it's not properly explained. It immediately stops people from accessing that material. Prem Samarag and Guru Soba, those I would say there are texts that have not received as much attention in the tradition prior to it having been translated into English. I think people knew about those texts. I think those texts were utilized in some sense, like Veer Singh quotes from it sometimes, but I don't think those texts were well known broadly prior to it becoming into English. So I think that's just the effect of where we're seating here now, where we're seated here, is that, because these texts are very simple to read and, they have some appeal to them, like Prem Samarag is just a wild text, like the type of things that it suggests in there. I think Prem Samarag is a real outlier as well in terms of the tradition, especially when you compare it to the other Rayatname from that time period. Not to say that, it should be dismissed. I just think it's a really interesting text. I think people should definitely engage with it. Same with Guru Soba. But yeah, I just think it's a simple reason of, it being in English and it also being kind of more condensed. Guru Soba, especially in terms of the history, where, Suraj Prakash, I think through the efforts of the podcast and other people doing translations, I think, that's going to spread more widely than these texts in the future.
As you mentioned, it was only once texts such as Prem Samarag and Gursobha were translated into English that they entered the collective consciousness of the community. What are some of the perils with translation? And with your own podcast, how do you go about ensuring you're as close to the authentic meaning as possible?
It's difficult. It's always a struggle because you have to understand exactly how a word is going to be interpreted in, let's say, the language in which it's being translated to. So in English, you have to understand how people are going to interpret it now with the context of the culture today. So there are issues, and I've had issues where I struggle on certain translations. I can give some examples of that now if you want, but on a really recent podcast, Guru Hargobind is explaining to Mata Kaula about the divine and about the true self, about, Mata Kaula is passing away. Guru Hargobind is giving her updesh to say that, listen, you are not the body. You are something beyond the body. Like Paramatma is not Pork. He's not a man. He's not Istri. And he's not Napunsuk. Napunsuk, the word there was Kaliv, also means Bankranu in Gurbani is called, which is, I put it in the podcast as eunuch. And this is in the like dictionaries, they'll say khosra or say hijra, and some of these words are deemed derogatory now in Punjabi. But essentially it means, in another definition in the dictionary, it said just da joda na hove, which doesn't have a mutual kind of a partner, and I was thinking about, what is the best word to use for that? Because eunuch conveys like somebody can become a eunuch, like for example the guards of a harem, of a Mughal harem, so like where the women would reside, the guards, the warriors there would be made eunuchs, as in they would be castrated, which is, yeah, and
Insane.
yeah, it's completely insane. So but then, so like how is the general population going to understand eunuch? Just that Jordan Ahove, which doesn't have an opposite or a partner, that really, to me in my mind, suggests, oh, we could use the word non-binary for that. But then if we use non-binary for that, it's bringing in today's dialogue with non-binary and trans, which is going to bring with it information that doesn't necessarily relate to how the text was using it, and just in the way of the text pointing towards something which is not associated with gender, divine, which is not associated with any type of physical characteristic, right? So those notions of translation, I find I struggle with at times, and I do the best that I can. And if there are mistakes or faults that I have made, I'm sure there's plenty. We're all doing the best we can in terms of translation, but yeah, those instances where you have to put a word into today's culture, which may interpret it in a different light, I find that time consuming and also, intellectually difficult. But that is the whole process. And another thing as well is like conveying translation in a way which is not devoid of flavor. This is a problem with translation, is like there was a Japanese scholar who was doing Sanskrit in like the 5th, 6th century. He was like, translation is chewing rice and then regurgitating it and feeding it to somebody, because you're basically taking out all the flavor and giving it back to somebody. And that's something that I had to really think about when because Suraj Prakash is so imbued with ras, with flavor, and it would be such a disservice to just convey, oh, he said this, he said that, he said that. So I try to be careful and mindful with my words to convey a similar feeling in today's culture of how language is used. So but it's a tough task, and yeah, I do the best I can. The music also, I hope, helps with that, but yeah, it's a really difficult task for translators. So for those reading or listening, please give us some kind of leeway and slack there.
So you made it to the end of another podcast episode. I hope you really enjoyed this. I had an absolutely amazing time with Jvala. We've certainly got more podcasts planned for the future. If you have any questions, don't forget to leave them in the comments below. Equally, don't forget to like, comment, and share this with everyone you know. Otherwise than that, I will see you in the next one.